again this semester, and I'm very pleased to present Professor Jason Coupet. I don't know how to pronounce your name, actually. Is that how you pronounce your name?
All right. Nailed it, man. First
okay,
attempt,
good.
too. That's pretty good.
And we had a surge when he was supposed to visit in person in the fall, and then we had another surge in COVID when he was supposed to visit in person today. But he still agreed to join us virtually. So we're disappointed we can't have a full day of just you all day, but we'll take what we can get, and we appreciate you agreeing to meet with doctoral students afterwards. So thank you for making the time. So he has a PhD in strategic management, a BS in economics, and it's from Michigan, by the way, and he will give you a hard time for being at OSU, so feel free to reciprocate. He conducts research on public and nonprofit management. And so it's a pleasure to have you. You've got 45 minutes. Everybody, please just limit your questions to clarifying questions until he's finished, and then we can have a more robust conversation after that. So thank you. Feel free to go ahead.
Cool. No, thanks for the warm welcome. Nice to see everybody. Let me, my new school uses WebEx, unfortunately, which had I known may have been a deal breaker. So I'm sort of going back and forth between the Windows systems and Zoom. So if I mess something up, please let me know. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about making or buying entrepreneurship, which public entrepreneurship with a synthetic control approach. And I should sort of preface it by like, this is my sort of first run at the SEM modeling, and so happy to engage feedback and ways to improve the approach there. And I'm also sort of new-ish to tech transfer, the domain which this will be situated, and so happy to talk to learn more from folks who may know more than me about that too. So, oh no, I'm sorry. How did this slide? I'm sorry. How did that get? Oh no, what happened? Where are my slides? Oh no, let me just keep going. There we go. So sorry about that. Yeah, so we'll start. I'll talk a little bit about the motivation Go Blue, the tech transfer. Then I'll talk a little bit about the tech transfer domain, Arizona State, and then the spinoff and what was hoped to be achieved there. Now I'll walk through the sample and design, and then some brief sort of findings and implications. So, all right. So if you, I mean, this is I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. I imagine the new institutional economics literature from the 70s and 80s, and then I would argue that the new public management stuff that spun off of that. There's this sort of axiom that comes out about the inherent inefficiency of sort of public sector production, where governance systems are sort of rarely transactionally efficient relative to other alternatives, because they have to manage political goals and public values that, if done away with, could sort of be done in a less cumbersome fashion by like these alternative private sector arrangements. And so one of the big conclusions from that rather large but empirically shaky body of literature, right, is that public sector entities should be entrepreneurial where possible, right, and sort of using these market, deferring to the market when they can, these sort of market-oriented strategies, service delivery when they can. So I mean, this is sort of the contracting, the big body of literature of contracting, right? A lot of that is about minimizing the frictions inherent in public production, collaboration, PPPs, all that, right? Selling goods on the marketplace, all of that is sort of is based on this idea that we should be engaged in the market when we can to sort of invoke the religious, the mythical efficiencies of this like perfectly clearing and frictionless marketplace, right? So one of the things that the sort of marketization strategies that a lot of public organizations take is to create these nonprofit organizations that are spun off and wholly owned by the government entity to deliver the goods or service. So the body of literature sort of denotes these as like GNCPOs, is what I'll be calling them, sort of government created or government controlled nonprofits. Although, you know, there are some for-profit entities in this space too, but for this one, we'll sort of stick to this nomenclature. this form of governance, surprise, surprise, gained popularity in the 80s, right? Along with, the whole Gordon Gekko, risky business, like let's get after it, right? The market take control. And it tracks with these axioms to like, we could do this in a more frictionless way, right? If we engage the private sector when we can, to sort of alleviate ourselves of these bureaucratic processes. And there's some newer work too, newer in the sense of the last 10 or 15 years, that says even when public sector entities do this, our entrepreneurs, they should expect to be worse at it than private sector organizations. And so there's really little you can do, but you should try to be more private, right? The trouble is, and again, this just won't be news to most of you, is that the notion that any of these marketization attempts or sort of institutional designs improve efficiency or performance, and even to some degree, the degree at which they reduce cost, the evidence of that is like decidedly mixed. And increasingly even more so actually with government controlled nonprofits, the evidence is somewhat scarce. There was a piece that came out in JPART last year that examined one of these. But other than that, we've got a lot of these spinoffs, but not a lot of good evidence that they achieve what they set out to in terms of like efficiency improvements. Part of the problem with that is that counterfactuals are really hard to construct in this space. So like you see a lot of these, over the 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of these like public-private efficiency comparisons, but you're just sort of taking one stack of set of organizations and comparing it to another one, right? And so there's no, the counterfactual is hard. Like, what would this particular institutional design look like if it were another institutional design, right? You just sort of get comparisons of these averages. So I try to address that a little bit in the context of technology transfer by constructing a synthetic control of a TTO at a publicly owned TTO at Arizona State that spun off into a GNCPO in 2003. And if you're unfamiliar with TTOs, everyone I know of, every Research One university has them, and most medium and large size non-R ones have them too. They're essentially these university either owned or affiliated offices that license the research, commercializable research that comes out of research at the within the university, right? So they work with faculty to transform, to license and patent whatever intellectual property that comes out of it. Patent if they deem it worth it. There's some variants in institutional design that we can talk about. And then they work to sell these licenses and patents to companies. And the idea here is to generate revenue for the university, right? As a sort of market revenue source that the university can use. Most public universities maintain their TTOs as in-house, right? And so they're part of the public governance. Some don't, either for legislative or like operational reasons. They're spun off as like these nonprofit, or in most cases launched as either nonprofit or for-profit entities. Arizona State's a little bit different in the sense that it started off, the TTO at ASU started off within its public hierarchy, and then in 2003 spun off. And so it presents an opportunity to use the synthetic control model to estimate, or to try to estimate the treatment effect of having spun off. And we look at the three different measures here. So revenue generated, the cost of contracting, so like what they spend on contracts, and then their overall licensing activity, right? So a little bit about the domain here. And again, feel free to jump in with questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. A little bit about the domain here. Technology transfer as a thing is
Uh-oh. Frozen.
Yeah, I'm guessing he'll come back eventually, hopefully.
Alan, do you have his, do we have his cell phone?
I don't. I could double check. I'll email him right now as well, just to check and let him know.
I can see if I have it too.
It looks like the connection might have just failed him, so I'll just reach out.
I'm sure he's going to log back on right now.
So, all right. So after 1981, universities are allowed to commercialize this. They bring them to market. So they work with faculty to capture that intellectual property, encourage them to submit patents and license whatever they come up with. They work within a process, typically internally, to see if those ideas are commercializable, and if so, they negotiate with firms to license, to either buy those licenses, to buy those patents, or to license the technology, right? And so they negotiate every aspect of the term, and the idea is that the TTOs will generate revenue either through equities, through royalties, or straight sales of that intellectual property. And if you read the literature around the launch of these, I mean, it's some 80s stuff, man. It's the New American University and the Entrepreneurial University, and the sort of third mission around engaging the marketplace. It sort of fits right into, in my mind anyway, like what the new public management literature was after here. And if it's just a little bit of a map about the institutional design, right? Typically, funding either comes from federal agencies, mostly from agencies, but sometimes from industry partners, into the university, and then we do what we do, and sort of maybe less us, but they're sort of on the other, like particularly at the engineering-based schools, like a lot of intellectual property, or potential intellectual property comes out of the research process. Those are remitted to TTOs as disclosures, right? And so a faculty member will disclose and say, I have an invention, or I have a potential invention, to the TTO. And the TTO either decides whether to patent it or to license the technology. Sometimes they do neither, because they figure it's sort of there's very little commercial appeal. And then those licenses are sold to firm A and firm B, which then do something with them on the product market, right? And so they either make or provide some service that uses that license that generates profit, and a piece of that profit comes back to the university, right? And so that's typically how that design is supposed to work. Questions about any of that? Thoughts? No. All right. I can't see everybody's face, so if you want to chime in.
How much does a university take?
It depends, right? So that every agreement, and this is part of why, as your esteemed dean would probably call it, a complex contract, right? They are every piece of them, every piece of every contract is negotiated individually, right? And so all of those terms are negotiated with the firm. I should say up front, most universities are very bad at this, right? Like the big theme of the literature is how difficult it is for lots of different reasons. There are a few that do really well, like MIT is like the Yankees. They make substantial revenue from their technology transfer process. And so everybody's often trying to, Georgia Tech's pretty good too, but everyone wants to be like MIT. But most universities really struggle and spend almost as much on the contracting process as they do in revenues to generate this. Some of that is because faculty can be really hard to deal with, which won't surprise most of you, or at least doesn't surprise me. But the royalties are negotiated in every contract. I will say too, there have been attempts to remedy this since the mid-90s, and that's part of how I got this data. There's an association of university technology managers. They have a portal called Transact, where every TTO, if you decide to remit your contracts, other TTOs can see your contracts and you can see theirs, with the idea of sort of helping to improve the contracting process and get more royalties and more of the value from firms. But on average, most places are still pretty bad at it. So there's no straight answer there. All right, so in Arizona in 1986, largely in response to the Bayh-Dole Act, there was a law passed that sort of allowed Arizona universities to launch these TTOs. They launched them initially at University of Arizona, Northern Arizona, and Arizona State. Initially, ASU's TTO was internal, similar to what happens at NC State and at UNC, which is sort of how I got to learn this a little bit. It's part of the university hierarchy, typically reports to the provost's office, that kind of thing. Some of them, because for legal reasons, are spun off into foundations. I could talk about that in a little bit. Actually, I guess now, right, for reasons similar to what happened in Arizona. So the Arizona State Constitution forbids public agencies from holding equity in private firms, right, for conflict of interest reasons. And so if you want to get paid in equity, let's say you're negotiating with a firm, they say, look, we'll instead of cash royalties, we'll give you an equity stake in whatever product that comes out of this. Arizona State Constitution forbids the university from taking a piece of it, right? So for a while, they could only get paid in sort of cash royalties and straight sale of intellectual property. So in part because of that, but there's a sort of broader story at hand here, at least I argue. ASU spun off its TTO operations into an external nonprofit LLC, sort of pretty complicated institutional design, and I don't fully understand yet, so I'm still reading. It's called the Arizona Technology Enterprise, otherwise known as AZTE. It's something totally different now, and I'll get to that in a second. And the idea was that, and if you dig through, I got to dig through some of the performance evaluations right around the launch, and the idea was to have AZT have this like the autonomy of a private organization, right? With the decisions being made independent from the political process. The whole idea was to sort of speed up this licensing and sort of let them go, right? Just sort of get them out of the politics of it, let them go, let them behave like they're in the market. They're going to negotiate bigger shares like that. Contracts will get done faster and at lower cost. Same story, right? This sort of the same sort of privatization story, the new public management story that we get out of the NIE stuff in the 80s. And so the spinoff happens in 93. And if you look at just the pre-post, so before and after the spinoff, that there's an argument. So these are in 1993 dollars, right? You sort of see revenue nearly doubled. So I stopped the post right at the recession. I feel like everything after 2008 here is probably not fair because markets sort of went wacky. So if you look at posts from 2003 to 2008, like average revenues nearly doubled. So did legal fees, though, or legal fees more than doubled, which sort of may indicate higher transaction costs than before. But licensing activity almost doubled too, right? And so you're like, well, we're doing more. There's more entrepreneurship. It sort of looks like this thing may have worked, may have sort of freed this up. But the problem with that, right, is as social scientists, this won't surprise you, right, is that we're looking only at ASU there, and there's no sort of, it's hard to think through what would this have been had we not spun it off. I mean, maybe these things would have increased anyway. And if you look at average licensing activity, so the solid line down here is ASU/AZTE, and this dotted line is like everybody else, right? You'll sort of see this upward trend anyway, right? Including after 2003, licensing shoots up for everybody from 2003 to right around the recession time. And just sort of eyeballing it, it looks like the trend for everybody else on average is probably higher than it is for ASU, even post-intervention. And so those sort of eyeballing the pre and post may not tell us what we think. The same thing for legal fees, right? This sort of looks like, again, solid line ASU, these sort of contracts costs, as I claim, sort of measure the cost of like negotiating a contract, seems to be increasing even more than it is for everybody else, right? And licensing activity, which went up substantially, but again, it went up substantially for everybody, right? And so what was and sort of thinking through what the effect of the spinoff might be, we need to sort of take into account what would have happened anyway. right? So that leads us to our design here. So what I did, when I say we is really we as in me and the way too many cheeseburgers I had this week. Start with an unbalanced panel from 93 to 2017 of tech transfer offices. There's an administrative database that the Autumn Network keeps, the network I mentioned before. Sort of it's an association of these TTOs that share best practices. There's an annual conference, all that. They can all see the same data I'm looking at, right? And so they can use it to benchmark each other. It's essentially a benchmarking collaborative is the way I would put it. There's also some legal advocacy and lobbying that happens as well, right? They sort of lobby on behalf of universities in terms of making sure they can keep as much intellectual property as possible. And so the data include both financial and operational measures to TTOs, but also some performance measures like their licensing activity, licensing revenues, et cetera. Right. The data are remitted year in by Autumn members, and they typically compile it pretty quickly and audited independently by sort of at random. My understanding is by a firm that compares them with SEC filings that are affiliated with the universities, of products that are affiliated with the university. So in 2016, there were about 226 of these, which should more or less track with what we think of as research producing, high level research producing entities. Although not all, I guess, will fit in that category. But universities with substantial tech transfer, technology, intellectual property activity. So we kept only the public universities, and I'll talk about why in a minute, because we want to use the SCM to construct that kind of factual. And then only those with complete data from 95 to 2010, and then we sort of stopped at 2010 because after that recession stuff gets noisy. And then we only looked at the in-house TTOs, so the public universities that had their TTOs in-house, which leaves us with a donor pool for the SCM of about 27.
So does that mean a lot of them don't have it in-house, Jason? If you get down to 27, a lot of them are contracting it out completely?
Yeah, for legal reasons. And some of them, so actually the drop from 161 to 27 was less about in-house and more about complete data. So the association, and that's sort of a big contingency here with how the donor pool is constructed. Although I'm sort of less worried about it than I was before. Like Autumn started in 93, and there were a few members, and then a lot more joined in 95, so you get a more robust data set. But after that, sort of folks started to drop in, where there's a gap between this, what we have in 95, which I think was around 60 something, I should put that up, 60 total members, up to 227 in 2017. So sort of that drop was less about in-house or out-house and more about not being Autumn members. So there's potentially some selection there in the sense that we're getting data from folks opting into this service. So who we have completely available from 95 to 2010 is not who, probably not representative of 2017. Although we do get a pretty good match pre-intervention, but we certainly worth noting for sure. Okay, so we use the synthetic control to estimate like this publicly owned counterfactual of AZTE. So otherwise we compare the performance in these 3 dimensions, so income, contract costs, and overall licensing activity, which we denote as just number of active licenses that the university has, the TTO has with the synthetic AZTE, right? The idea is to sort of estimate this treatment effect by comparing AZT's performance with like a synthetic AZTE that we get from the synthetic control model. So if you're unfamiliar with synthetic controls, they were developed sort of principally by Body A. And interestingly enough, it was sort of surprising to me as I got to know the literature a little bit. They can sometimes outperform difference in difference designs if there are appropriate number of lags and the match does well, which was surprising. Because anytime you say matching, people eye roll. But if you look at the the evidence of it, I was sort of pleasantly surprised at how well these can do under the right circumstances. The idea here is that we sort of, the models optimally choose a set of weights that we essentially apply to also optimally chosen sort of peers to estimate a counterfactual. And then we say, basically, it's a simple comparison of what happened with that counterfactual versus what you observe in performance. So again, here, we're just looking at the sort of difference, in what we observed, denoted here by Y sub I sub J, minus the summed weighted counterfactuals, right? I'm gonna walk through in a minute how we got to what we did, where this W star is a vector of optimally chosen weights. When we say optimally, when the SEM sort of first came out, it was a matter of some debate, but mostly now, optimally means sort of minimizing the mean squared error of the prediction, right? And so pre-intervention, you want to get as close to match as possible to before. And so we're essentially weighting our observations and weighting what we match on to make sure that match is pretty close. And then after intervention, you can sort of compare what happens, right? It does require to work well, particularly with unobserved selection on unobserved variables, a sort of reasonably long period. What's reasonable sort of obviously depends on your particular variance, your question, your intervention, but reasonable enough to get a match that is convincing, right? And so that's sort of where we are. And if we have a reasonably long pre-period, historically, these models actually do a pretty good job of kicking out the influence on an observable set. My reasoning behind that is sort of similar to like dynamic panels, right? If you lag enough Ys, you can kick out most of the unobserved selection effects and sort of estimate a reasonably valid beta there.
So did you have a little bit of a hard time doing this for ASU because they're such a massive university? I mean, I don't know how their tech transfer compares to other universities, but in terms of sheer number of students and the amount of money they're dealing with, they're probably in the tails for a lot of this stuff, but maybe not.
Yeah, no, so they are in terms of like student size, but in terms of like research inputs and outputs, not so much. Like so it's sort of evident here. Now, some of this is drag out outliers from the MITs and Georgia Techs, right? And this sort of tech bubble, the tech bubble bursting notwithstanding, you can sort of see where Arizona State is, like revenue, like they're sort of below average in terms of like what they make. And then the same thing with licensing, like these are just, some of this is outlier driven. So, the comparisons are here, but they're not, they're below, they were historically have been below average in terms of chunking the shop. We ended up matching on universities that are pretty similar sized. We'll walk through that in a minute, but no, you're right in terms of like, they're a behemoth of a university for sure. No, that's absolutely right, right? And so, perfect segue. We ended up, so we in our model, our optimal matches ended up being University of Oregon, mostly University of Oregon and KU, ironically, two other large public research universities, University of Virginia, and then there was a little bit of Minnesota and Florida State in there. So all universities that we would consider probably in the tails of sort of public universities. And in order to test this, I did play around with some other matching, and the fit was worse pre. We can talk about this after we talk about results. We had a worse fit pre with other match. So I kicked some of these out and matched with other universities to sort of, and ended up optimally matching with other folks. Worse pre-fit, but similar post trends. just with a much higher root mean squared error as a robustness check. That's a perfectly, that's a good point. That's a common robustness check with these models. So the first thing we want to look for is some pre-predictor balance. So we constructed this synthetic AZTE and more or less, so as is common, we ended up matching totally on past outcomes. And in the literature, that's almost always how you get the best match anyway. So I'm not sort of surprised that that was optimal for us. Although we did, again, I tinkered with this. Again, we can talk about that more. I dropped 95 through 98 and matched on total research expenditures and a couple of other matching covariates. Again, worst fit pre-intervention, which is expected, but similar trends after it, mostly. But here, so again, we matched, our model matched totally on past outcomes. We've got 8 years here, and pretty similar values pre, which shouldn't surprise. If you look at, onto what we found now, pre-intervention, our matches here from 95. How do you do the circle thingy? There's a marker up here I was gonna use. I'll figure it out. But if you look sort of pre-intervention, just where that dotted line is, pretty good match here. Before this sort of looks much more or less in line, and then ASU spins off, and there looks to be a sort of negative treatment effect here of having spun off into the GC NPO as compared to the synthetic ASU. And we didn't find, so the treatment effect here was negative, but probably wouldn't be significant. More or less the same sort of trend in contract costs. So sort of less revenue than the counterfactual, about the same trend in contract costs. And lower licensing activity on average too, right? And so I cut this off at 2009 because it gets wonky after the recession in terms of post-treatment period. But if you do drag it out to 2015, the difference is worse. So apparently it looks like the recession hit AZTE harder, and there's some qualitative evidence for that too. But the fit got wonkier having that post after having the post go that far out. And I'm imagining just because there's a lot of noise sort of post recession, and so I cut it off at 2009. We can talk about that too. But just to sort of sum it up, right? In general, we saw a sort of average treatment effect of about $2 million a year in licensing revenue for comparing the synthetic AZTE to AZTE to the actual one. About $24,000 in licensing and legal fees, which is probably nothing to lose sleep about, but also a negative effect of licensing activity. So there were fewer licenses and less money generated by having that as a result of having that spun off. So there are a couple of robustness checks that are common to sort of see the degree to which you would have this by chance. So the first one, there's no graph for this. We tinkered with some different placebo times, and so the idea, so there's a placebo test that is done where we say, okay, we imagine, instead of specifying an intervention in 2003, let's specify one in 99. And the idea here is nothing happened differently in 1999, and so we shouldn't see any effect. And we find that to be to more or less hold. So we played with 99, 2000, 2001, 98, and we don't detect any effect in post-intervention outcomes with those placebo checks. The matches are worse because we have less years to match on, but it's more or less past that check. And then there's a sort of leave one out robustness test where essentially what we do here is, okay, so let's we imagine that, you know, the research question we're interested in Arizona State is the sort of treatment effect here. But let's take Arizona State and put it back in the donor pool. And then let's test for each one of the donor pool, each member of the donor pool, we sort of pretend as if that was the treated the treated unit, and then plot out what the effects would be. And so you could sort of see the dark line here is ASU. The negative effect that ASU hit is mostly in the tails here. And so that sort of tells us that what happened to ASU is more or less unique. Most of the counterfactuals fit with the trend line, and that there's an effect here that is in the tails. Sort of the two most common robustness checks there. So we noticed what seems like a negative treatment effect from having spun this out. The increase in contract cost seems negligible. And I should say there's a paper under review that we do these sort of comparisons of averages across public and nonprofit TTOs, and then the ones that are in-house to spin out. We don't notice meaningful differences between these institutional designs. This one seems to be negative, but this notion that spinning them off leads to this higher productivity level doesn't seem to hold empirically. So a couple of takeaways, and this is sort of how we frame, how I'm sort of framing the manuscript, although that's still underway. If you read, so the new public management stuff comes out of the new institutional economics, all that old Ronald Coase and Alki and Dipset stuff from the 60s forward. And if you read that stuff carefully, and I recommend it if you're having trouble sleeping, if you read that stuff carefully, you notice there's never this. Oliver Williamson himself actually had a piece in the late 90s where he's like, whoa, this notion that like government's always worse is sort of, no, we never said that, right? That sometimes, like, we ask public sector entities to do really hard things, right? Whether transaction costs are sort of dominated by what that thing is, right? And perhaps are not the notion that we can expect this like sort of free market actor to come in and improve overnight, Gordon Gekko style, doesn't necessarily fit what the theory suggests anyway. Like, these institutional designs are going to have transaction costs endogenous to what's being bought or sold or produced. And in testing them, we need to evaluate them with all of those contingencies in mind, right? And so this notion that the public institutional design will inherently be inferior is something that's probably not consistent with the NIE to begin with. These products are loaded with frictions, right? And it's also sort of good to remember, like, we aren't delegating to markets, right? We're delegating to firms. So a lot of the mechanisms that would normally be in place, like the discipline of a stock market to make sure that costs are optimal and performance is optimal and revenues are optimal, don't exist, right? We created an entity. There's no sort of market, that the degree to which that there's market discipline there is under debate. That entity reports to the same firm that was producing it, the same organization that's producing it in the first place. It's sort of, we need to think more carefully about these institutional designs, I think, and empirically test these things before we launch with this, like, sort of, let's devolve as much as we can out of what government produces into these other firms. And at least with the two studies we're working through now, it sort of seems like there aren't these sort of benefits to spinning off that the literature suggests there may be. So there's some qualitative evidence about this too. There was some lukewarm audit reports. Most of the audit reports, and I was thinking about sort of putting this together as another study, between 2005 and 2018, were lukewarm about AZTE. AZT also grabbed Northern Arizona University as a partner, and that since devolved as well. There was, they were dinged a lot for sort of less, so there's a whole parts of this process where you have to work with faculty to get them to disclose inventions and encourage them to do so. They seem to be worse at that than the in-house unit was. There's evidence that contract negotiations lengthened and some of the firms balked at terms. I imagine there's an effort there to sort of grab more value from those licensing agreements. But again, we didn't notice any sort of mind-blowing differences in contract costs as we measured them. AZTE was rebranded as SkySong Innovations in 2018. Is in part my understanding is because of some of these performance issues. They're shifting away from licensing and patents and more towards incubating startups, which is interesting because most of the literature says that startups are way harder to launch, much harder to contract, and are much more unpredictable, right? You're sort of looking for a $1 million ticket, right? Some innovation that produces revenue. They're harder to do, but MIT does them, so why not, right? Like, and then another interesting case I think is that IU had, again for legislative reasons, had an external nonprofit TTO for most of its history, but they ate theirs in 2018. They put it in house. And I'm sort of digging through the details a little bit about that now, why that was, and trying to update this data set to get some empirical evidence of maybe investigating a pre-post there too. The pandemic may make that less possible. But again, there, in my mind anyway, there are questions about sort of spinning this off as a sort of free private entity and having that work as a solution for this thing, which is that public sector institutions do, which is inherently really hard. It's difficult, right? All right, so that's sort of all I got. A shout out to the office of the RI office at NC State, which worked with me to get the data. And then I sort of got into tech transfer because of a grant I got. Collaborative at Michigan with the Sloan Foundation that funded some related work on performance measurement and efficiency modeling that the NSF, part of a package NSF is using to advocate for more NSF funding, and got to know the space a little bit. This doesn't use the IRIS data, which does not allow us to identify the universities, the TTOs. Otherwise, we may be able to match on some other cool stuff. But I did get the idea because of that grant. So cool. So that's it. I don't have anything else. Thank you for letting me walk through that. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I have plenty of questions, but I'll let other people jump in. Do you think maybe we unshare your screen so you can see folks and shame them into stepping up? I don't know. Well, I mean, in terms of characterizing, and feel free other people to raise your hand or just start talking, but that was great. In terms of characterizing the results, I was thinking about how much you rely on the ducks. So the Oregon ducks, and it seemed like with your robustness check, maybe they didn't have that much of an impact, but I suspect they were partly responsible for how close to the ASU line the counterfactual got. And so I was just thinking, maybe I would, and maybe you disagree, but maybe I would frame this as, we can kind of rule out positive effects, but we can't really say that they're negative because of the overlap. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, yeah, maybe. I think so. Maybe there's some significance testing to the synthetic control. I'm still learning, and so working through now. But as one of an additional robustness check, so I kicked Oregon out and rematched. And I remember, I think if I recall right, the big match there. So it's common to have sort of one entity dominate the match. So there was one where the big match there was like NJI, was New Jersey Institute of Technology. And you saw a similar effect. The one, I'm gonna share the screen. The one that matches what you mentioned. So if you look at the leave one out, if I kick all of these out of the donor pool, you end up with a much smaller donor pool. But then I end up matching just on see, that's why I need to find the marker. I got my cursor going and you can't see my cursor, so I'm talking to myself. If you the gray lines that are closer to the AZTE line, if you kick all of the top lines out and just match on those, you'll notice there's still a gap here between, so Oregon is in one of these, the top lines. So if you kick Oregon out and a bunch of other ones and just match on the low lines here, there's still a noticeable gap from intervention through about 2006, where it gets murkier and then it drops off again. So that's sort of what the leave robustness out test, it keeps kicking one out and redoing it, and you should see the same effect. And then I also have some additional ones, some additional models where, like I matched including private. There are nonprofit universities that have TTOs in-house. And when I included them, it was all the same match, except also Northwestern. But sort of same, really similar trend here on average. So I'm actually encouraged by what happens when you kick the ducks out and match on other ones. But yeah, the fit typically changes some depending on who you match with.
Thank you. And I'll pause and let people talk unless I don't hear anything, then I'll just start talking again.
I'll fire away because I'm still learning what I'm doing. So this is all helpful.
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, it looks like
Aaron
Aaron,
has a question.
yeah.
No, please, Angie, go first.
It has to do my question. Thank you for your presentation first. So I guess my question is, from the knowledge that you have from the specific case of Arizona State, do you see that there were kind of changes in specific practices or the strategy that they were following in terms of how they were, like, I don't know, what I'm thinking is like maybe they changed and they went more to scouting instead of working with industry, or they went to work with industry instead of working with the technology that was being pushed by the university. Because if we don't analyze like without knowing exactly what were the practices that change, how can we say that this is a change from having a government versus like a private entity? And it's not just because the entity changed, and because the entity changed, you had loss of trust, and you had turnover, and you had problems with keeping the licenses up, or like in terms of the transition. Is this kind of like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to parse out.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I've started documenting some of it. So you're a step ahead of me there. From what I can glean from, so I've got a collection of audit reports, reviews with the state legislature, and from what I could sort of find from internet sleuthing, a few contracts that they negotiated, that ASU negotiated pre and then ASU negotiated post. So I haven't sort of formally analyzed it, but best I can tell, there were a couple of shifts, a couple of things happened. So when ASU shifted to AZTE, there was a lot of turnover. So new leadership, new staff, and they never really fully recovered. So even that turnover turned over again. And there was some staffing issues that impacted, so two impacts. One is just operational, right? There's sort of fewer people, people with sort of the institutional knowledge of ASU to pull this off, but also hurt relationship with faculty. So there was just some qualitative evidence that like no one knew the people in the TTO office anymore. And so you get a random email that's like, hey, do you have any inventions to disclose? It's sort of easy to just kick it away, right? Like it, but the office before, there was a more overt strategy to like develop relationships both with firms and with faculty who are disclosing inventions. And so some of the turnover, best I can glean from the audit reports, sort of impacted those long-term relationships. The other thing that changed, it seems like they got more aggressive about, and you would expect this, about getting value from those contracts, right? And so they wanted more royalties from the firms, which lengthens negotiations, right? And if those attempts at getting more value are not ultimately more successful than the counterfactual, you're just raising costs without any sort of revenue benefit. There's another sort of lingering thing here that makes all of this a little bit weird. TTOs are notorious generally for chasing home runs, right? Because the marginal effect of like, you want that one big ticket item you have is worth 300 little patents that you license, right? So at NC State, right, they're notorious for this too. They missed out on SaaS, and so they're like looking for big ticket items, right? And so there's variance here that may be a little bit random in the sense that, you know, how do you predict somebody coming up with a crazy invention that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Like, it's hard to, unless you're MIT, where you're churning those things out. I mean, they got venture capitalists, like, you know, circling the university looking to fund what's happening there. For everybody else, it's like you're sort of looking for that home run for sure. And so all that to say, I know I can glean from the audit reports that there was more of that, right? Like, let's find this home run and sort of less dinking and dunking. Fewer singles and doubles. Let's try to actually hit one out of the park. And if you don't actually hit one, right, then you look worse off than you would have otherwise. So all of those are things that could be going on, but there's probably a qualitative study worth digging through here at some point.
Yeah, can I follow up a little bit with a comment? Just what I wonder is how much of that has to do with the character of the new organization, or it has just to do with a shift in the strategy. That can happen even if you have the TTO within the university, or tied to a more like government approach, or tied to the public sector more closely. You can still have you can still be trying to get the big catch and not maybe like thinking of protecting smaller invention, or not doing so much scouting and things like that. So how much of that has to do with the change to the private entity versus the change to a new entity, and also to just a change in strategy?
Yep. No, I think that's right. It's hard to know what practices are sort of endogenous to that change or not. The one sort of, let me stop sharing again. I'm sorry, I left the thing up. The one sort of encouraging dimension about that is the leave one out robustness test. Sort like, I'm imagining, right? You could sort of imagine that of the 27 in a donor pool from 2003 to 2008, there was some strategic initiatives, and you don't see significant departure from that you're there. There are no sort of huge sharp effects that you may pick up based on. So it sort of something happened in 2003 in Arizona that looks like it's in the tails. Maybe that's privatization or endogenous to it or not. That's sort of tough to tease out. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Could it be the reporting? Because AUTM, it's self-reported. It's all self-reporting.
Yeah, it's self-reporting, but it's also audited at random by an independent firm that compares them with SEC reports that the TTOs have to file if they are particularly, they're like reporting equity and licensing gains, right? And so those contracts are stored at Autumn. They can see who you're negotiating with, and then what that firm reported they're paying you from licenses and royalties. So my understanding is that the data set is audited that way. But yeah, it could be that too, right? There's all this other stuff that goes along with shifting institutional form for sure that can be difficult to tease out.
We have 3 minutes, so if someone wants to jump in with another question, or I can do it. Erin?
I'd like to, yeah, I wouldn't mind asking a question. I'll try to make it quick. Hey, Jason, thanks for the presentation.
Hello.
Your ears may have been ringing a couple of weeks ago because we were talking about you in the nonprofit research seminar that a few of the faculty here, Long and Stephanie and I put together, and some of the students on the call here in that session. And we actually watched portions of your Ars Nova session on contributions of economic theory to nonprofit studies. So my question, I say that as setup because my question is much more theoretical and broad, more than these like more methodological questions that are probably more helpful to you on the paper. But I was noticing at the beginning of your slides, the way that you set up this public inefficiency and some of the reasons for that being political goals. When I hear that, I hear democracy, public values. When I hear that, I'm thinking, well, these are things that nonprofits, mission have as well. So for me, much of that has to do with equity. And so I have kind of two questions related to that. One is, if it seems like theoretically there's this relationship between inefficiency and potentially equity, what does equity look like in this context? And then if you'd permit me to be just a little bit more critical with my question, does perhaps pointing out the inefficiency of an arrangement like this sort of draw attention away from the importance of equity and maybe even reify the importance of inefficiency relative to equity?
It's a good question. It's one I get a lot. And so there's a really good paper written by Christopher Grandy. I think he's at University of Hawaii. It's a PAR piece in, I want to say 2009 that addresses this well. I think we sort of, and I don't say this to you, just in general, we can make a straw man of what efficiency means in this space, in the sense that because we talk about it as so much as like cost, but it's not. Like if you think about the way that efficiency is supposed to be constructed, it's public, in our sort of public service space, it's the value that we get, sort of understanding that cost is a constraint, right? It's sort of as big a part of the conversation as like socially what we get. Like allocative efficiency is, are these resources distributed in a way that makes the most sense? And so to me, it's inherently part of that conversation. That dichotomy, I've sort of never seen the word efficiency as independent from values, right? It's sort of right, like the way I was explaining this to somebody here. Like you can think about it. This is a little bit of a morbid example, right? But like when you can lose weight by like cutting off your right arm, right? But like you need your right arm, right? So if you're trying to lose 20 pounds, maybe that's not the best thing to do. It's always both, right? It's always like what you're trying to do versus what it's costing. Those costs are not always financial. Sometimes they're just sort of, we don't live in a universe where everything is infinite. And sometimes focus on efficiency tells you we're not doing enough of something, right? If you look at that, what you're putting in, and you could get 20 out by putting another 10 more, then that means you should invest, right? It's sort of a, to me, not a dichotomy. I see efficiency as laden with values, right? Particularly because my own perspective, a lot of what we're taught about sort of inherently what the most efficient thing to do is taught to us like it's objective, but it's actually laden with values, and it doesn't stand up empirically. Like a lot of the axioms that we walk away with are like, it's like based on some really shaky stuff, right? And so to me, talking about it helps tease some of that out and reframes the conversation in a way that's more consistent with democracy and public values. Making sure that when we do something, the communities that are supposed to get it, like actually get it and get the most out of it that we intend for them to get. And there's not stuff lost in the process. Does that help?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think, not treating them as a dichotomy or inverse in relationship I think is really meaningful. It just also appeared like, especially the way you were presenting the literature, that public inefficiency is because they're democratic and because they have values, right? Or so it seems like it's maybe been framed that way in the past. So I just wonder if you have kind of an opportunity to like bring that into the paper somehow. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, no, that's a great book. And it is framed like that. Like they do say like these poor souls that care about like voting and process and equity, like shame on them. Like let the market run, right? Like it really is the 80s, right? It's like, you know, take this small mom and pop firm that is selling the ice cream at $3 because they want people to buy it, and you let the guy come take it over, and now he sells it for $6 because the profit is high. It dovetails really well with all of those actions that come out. And I think part of how I see my role is like challenging some of those, like, you know, we're tasked to do these things because governments are often better at them, right? Or at least as good. And if you're not having any efficiency gains and we're better at the equity thing, maybe keep this in the public sphere.
That's a great way to end it. Big ideas to end it. We're out of time, amazingly. Thank you for taking the time to present to us. I think you have a separate meeting with doctoral students. Is it a different link, Alan? Same link, staying here? Everyone's staying here? Okay. So next, 2 weeks from now at Colloquium, we have Mike DeKay. He's from Department of Psychology. So February 21st, make sure you log in for that. Professor Coupet, thank you. Stick around.